I'm Scott Allen Miller. It is the 9th of November 2022, and welcome to my vlog of daily life in Nicaragua. Today is Wednesday, and it was a work day. Not very much going on. I was in my office, which is right there, and I'm recording today on the Olympus OMD EM1 Mark II with the 25mm lens at f2.0, and I've got the Tascam recorder doing the audio. This is my first time doing this in this particular setup where the Tascam is sitting on a table. I want to know how it sounds, so fingers crossed that this ends up sounding pretty good. This setup I like a lot with how it turns out. And my foot, sorry, I've got something in my mouth. My foot has been bothering me for several days. My right foot, the one that I broke, and I'm trying to avoid walking around too much right now because it is in a lot of pain a lot of the time. I think it's soft tissue damage, but this has been going on for a bit, and I really need to find ways to baby it in the hopes that it gets a chance to repair itself. So I'm avoiding the streets. Walking seems to be okay. It's walking on the uneven ground where sometimes, quite often, there ends up being pressure on the ball of my foot where the soft tissue is damaged, and then it's incredibly painful. So trying to just avoid that for a little while. So I apologize for the boring subject separation and everything of the videos, but that would be why. All right. So, but I am going to do some, right? I'm not avoiding it completely, just only when it makes sense. So today, mostly was working in the office all day. This evening, Liesl and I finished watching the Lord of the Rings series. We watched The Return of the King, which is part 3, and completes having watched the entire Hobbit in extended edition, followed by the complete Lord of the Rings in extended edition. So that's something like 9 hours and 12 hours for a total of 21 hours of Tolkien's universe for Liesl, and this is the first time that she's been old enough to watch them and really understand it. She's never seen The Hobbit before, and when she saw The Lord of the Rings last time, it was not extended, and she was so young she doesn't really remember at all. She kind of has a vague impression of dragons or whatever. But now she really got into it and really enjoyed it, and we had a really good time just together going through the series and a bit of discussion about the characters and why they did what they did and what was different from the books, which is not that much. In The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit was ridiculous. Talking about why one movie was amazing and one movie was terrible, all that kind of stuff. We actually really had a good time and got really into it. So this was a bit of a literary discussion, really, for her through movie form, which for me, I really feel like her generation doesn't have books the way that we did in our generations. The world has moved on. There was a time not that long ago, only a few generations, that books were essentially inaccessible, and people going through normal school didn't spend their time reading books. That is a relatively recent thing in the last couple hundred years. Prior to that book, even at the time of like Thomas Jefferson, books were so expensive that normal people couldn't have them. So they were treated very differently. And then in recent history, books became really, really cheap. And so they became the thing that everyone did as bulk entertainment. But that was replaced by television and movies. And movies stopped being a thing you go to the theater for and started rolling into the television streaming experience. And really, those have supplanted books in a lot of ways. And it seems awkward to say that to people of my age, Gen X and older, because we grew up in a world where those things were considered bad entertainment, and books, for some reason, while just as passive, were considered good. This doesn't actually make any logical sense. You can't make any reasonable argument for why books would be better than television. You can make actually quite a strong argument that television and movies are better because they force you to keep paying attention and moving along, whereas a book, you can just fall asleep at any time. And a book, you can slow down to a ridiculous pace. Books do force you to use your imagination, but so do movies, right? Like, that argument is a weird one. But movies have more to them. Music and things that can't be filled in. You can make an argument either way. The point being, both of them are just passive bulk entertainment. The idea that one of them is important and one isn't doesn't make sense. In both cases, the thing that makes them important is they are part of our collective consciousness of storytelling in society. And so the value of them is doing the thing that most people do. Most people don't read books. Most people see movies. Books are so sprawling that if you do read a book, there's a good chance that no one else you know has ever read that book. I know in my case, there are very few books I've ever read that I can talk to anyone about, but movies is a shared experience. Most movies, if I want to talk to someone about Jurassic Park, just saying that, most of my viewers are like, oh yeah, I've seen Jurassic Park. But if I said Johnny Tremaine, most of my viewers would say, I've never read Johnny Tremaine. In fact, most of you will probably say I've never heard of Johnny Tremaine. But when I was a child, that book was considered one of those books everyone would read, right? that social consciousness that we expect from books actually failed pretty heavily. Sure, To Kill a Mockingbird might be an exception, but in general, very few people have read those books. So we don't have that shared consciousness, and we don't have that shared literary experience to use to communicate to each other in the way that we intend, for the reason that we say books are good. Movies and television shows have taken over that role and have done it much better than books ever did. And while I'm not a fan of either, the idea that society should have literary experiences as our shared communications is a poor argument at best. There are reasons for it. I do understand the concept of needing to have complex stories and characters that we can relay very quickly through shared experience. Understood. But that is relatively minimal. The amount of television and movies and stuff that people watch today is so much, just like people who read books all the time, right? It's so much that you can't have that shared experience anymore. It only works when you have a relatively low number of very, very shared experiences. And that's something that society is moving away from. Streaming is making that less likely, just as the easy publishing of books, especially in digital format, has completely obliterated that concept. Dominica reads more books than anyone I've ever known, and yet she doesn't read a single book that anyone we've ever known has ever seen before. That means that all that shared value is gone. They're just her being told stories. It's no different than she was standing in a room and someone was just rambling on about a story she was mildly interested in that no one else heard. Is that a bad thing? No. If she's interested in leaning against the wall and listening to a story while sipping a coffee, fine. That's a perfectly reasonable way to spend an afternoon, but it doesn't carry any particular value if that story doesn't have a literary shared experience to use as communications medium with someone else, or doesn't cause you to think differently about the world. Some books do take you in that direction. To Kill a Mockingbird, Foundation, they exist, but in general, books aren't like that. And when they are, if you look at television and movies, they're likely just as much like that, maybe more, because it's easier to convey a more dramatic experience. Most people struggle to find books that realistic. It is easier for the bulk of people, the majority of people, to see televisions and movies and understand what they're seeing. You can read as many books as you want about the Vietnam War, and they may convey a lot of facts to you, but seeing a movie about the Vietnam War is much more likely to be valuable to you, because only by seeing Vietnam itself do you understand the landscape, what the weather is like, what the terrain is like. You can describe those things and get some of that across. It's not the same as actually showing the location. Talking about troop movements is not the same as seeing troop movements. Things like that. You don't become connected to characters in books the way that you become to actual human actors. It is simply different. We connect with real people more than we connect with stories of people. And so there is actual value to be had in those things beyond what we used to have in books. And I will argue that all of them are completely annihilated in value by video games, both because video games have a greater shared experience chance than any of those other things, because there are fewer video games on the market than books or television or movies. So when you're playing one, you're much more likely to play one that someone else has played and be able to have that shared literary experience. And because it is active instead of passive, it simply takes it into a completely different category of cognitive interaction. Passive media is kind of a joke compared to interactive in every way, whether it's education, your engagement, your ability to connect with characters, your ability to understand the plight of your protagonist. All of those things are not just better in interactive literature, they are a completely different experience, to the point where it is actually, I believe, completely negligent for schools to be teaching passive literature beyond the absolute necessity to have a base shared experience with the past, to understand how people used literature in the past, because the interactive literature of the future has improved our shared experience, has improved our ability to connect with characters to such an astounding degree. I think it should be bordering on criminal for schools to forsake the obviousness of the value of the educational experience on one side, just to take the easy route of repeating the mistakes of the past. But of course, that's what they're going to do, because that's exactly what schools do. But that, and I will argue that all day long, I have never heard someone make any reasonable argument for why books are even acceptable, other than we've always done it. We made mistakes in the past, we should make them in the future. That's the only argument I've ever heard, and it's the only one that is likely to be used, because it really has very few advantages. Of course, we should be able to read, but beyond being able to, Does wanting people to read beyond that base level actually carry value? If it's a thing you enjoy, great. It's your form of passive entertainment. Go enjoy it. But don't look at it as a specific value as it was taught to us when we were young. They used to try to excuse not taking the time to focus on active education because it was easy to hand us a book and tell us to do it ourselves. They used to focus on books when we were young because it was a way to not have to bother teaching us. They could just hand us something and expect us to go spend a bunch of time. It was busy work. They made it sound like it was important because they had to justify the busy work, just like homework. Homework doesn't provide any real value to normal learners. In fact, it takes away a lot of value. Not that studying and all that is bad, but coming up with busy work just to take away the free time we need for our brains to calm down so that teachers don't have to spend time coming up with lessons plans and ways to educate is terrible. That is how books were used. That is why people tried to make the excuses and drilled into us. Not just that books were important to read, that reading a book excused you from anything. Oh, I can't go to work. I'm reading a book. I can't go to sleep. I'm reading a book. I was late for school. I was reading a book. Reading a book was seen as some magic panacea to just excuse you from anything. It was that one activity that was always seen as okay, but it was no different than if you were reading a comic book or watching a TV show. If you're watching Seinfeld at night, that's not a bad thing, but you would never say, oh, I'm sorry, I was watching Seinfeld. I can't do these important things because it's excusable to watch TV. No, we gave TV was like this evil thing you had to cut off and you had to limit people. But no one ever limited you on books, yet books were probably worse than TV. We treated it specially. We also had, that was a fly directly in front of the lens. I saw it flash. It's now walking on the lens, but not in the part you can see. It was so much so that when things were put into print, you were constantly taught. This was the rule when I was in school. If it was in print, you could use it as a reference. It didn't matter how much you knew it was fake. It didn't matter how much you had no basis for believing it. As long as it was printed by a publisher, the act of making it a book made it sacrosanct. It was as if God himself came down and blessed all pulp when it was pressed into thin sheets of paper, said, if it gets written on this, it must be true. And if it's not true, that's okay. You're excused from having to have conscious thought about it. You don't have to apply common sense or do research or fact check because it's on paper. They did this, of course, because it allowed newspapers to control the populace, and it made a lot of sense. It made school easy for teachers and made government able to easily push ideas through the media. And the media, which was big business, of course, had a lot of alignment with the government, whether it was conspiracy or simply the way that economics logically work doesn't matter. The fact is, it made it easy to manipulate the populace and make them not question things as long as you put it into print. Today, that sounds absurd. That same concept of putting things into print is like writing an article on Facebook, making a tweet on Twitter. We know those things need to be fact-checked. We know they're almost always fake. We know there's nothing behind them in most cases. And if they are real, it's because someone happened to repeat a real source, not because they did any research on it. We know that today. Our consciousness of society has changed and now realizes we need to engage our brains and we need to fact check. We need to be using common sense when we're looking at media. But we were taught hardcore. It was drilled into us. You could never question a business large enough to put something on paper, because once they did that, they were not to be questioned. And yes, if you were at the highest levels of government, if you were another publisher, you could challenge those things. But as a normal person, you could not challenge them. You had to have references from someone who was willing to pay to put it on paper, because your opinions yourself in a research paper were considered invalid. You could only have an opinion if it copied something that was already in paper or expanded upon it without anything contradicting it. That was insane. The things that they taught us to not question and the things that they questioned were absurd. But they did it for lots of reasons that make sense if you just stop and think about it for a minute. And all of that is to say why I think watching The Lord of the Rings actually was more important than reading the books for my children, and why I have no particular issue with them not really liking to read and not wanting to go out and find books, because if that's something you love, then it's fine. That's your passive entertainment. If you prefer movies, then that's passive entertainment for you. You may like YouTube, and YouTube is slightly less passive than those things because you can interact with the source. Not in all cases. If you go to certain YouTube channels, there's no way to interact with the people who actually make the content. But the majority of YouTube, you can. You can talk directly to them. You can ask questions. You can get involved. You can add commentary. You can talk to other people about it because they're talking to each other. Can you do that with a movie? Not really. You'd have to find a group separate from the movie. Can you do it about a book? Sure, you can have a book group that does it. You got to really put those things together, and your group of people who are going to discuss it are probably people you've pre-selected in most cases. But with something like YouTube, you may be talking to the entire world of people who are intaking that material and having conversations at a completely different level that you've never been able to do before. And the value of that in moving passive entertainment into an actively interactable format is amazing. All those things I find as improvements over the original way of handling it, right? Books are the worst, the most passive, the least effort, the most unreliable, the least shared experience. Television and movies move into a better category. There's more shared experience. There's a little bit more engagement with the mind. You're more likely to remember something that you see in that form than you are to remember something from a book. That's one of the reasons that books are dangerous. Most people, not all, most people struggle to remember things that they've read in a book. I happen to be a person who can use books to learn pretty effectively, but I am the exception, not the rule, and I have to be aware of that. It is easy for someone like me to push books. And remember, I'm a published author. I've been a published author for a long time. I believe that books are important for certain reasons, but I try to stay within a realm of reason. I don't have some unrealistic expectation of books. They are not a replacement for better formats. They simply fill in gaps that are missing. The value as you move up the stack from books to movies to something like YouTube, where you can have that engagement, where you can have corrections, where you can have remixes, and then up to things like video games or other forms of interaction, interactive entertainment, interactive literature. Video games on their own, it doesn't have to be a game. It can be walking simulators and other things. We often classify as games because they share mechanisms, and so game has become the word associated with it, much like Dungeons and Dragons. It's not actually a game. We think of it as a game because it uses a lot of game mechanics and it just makes it easier for people to talk about. Those aren't actually games. In many cases, video games are games, not all, right? If you're playing Skyrim, it's not really a game. There's a story to be told. You're going to interact with it, but the game mechanism can be turned on and off, or essentially on and off. And when I play it, I turn it off. And Skyrim's a great example. Liesl's been playing it right now until the computer died. It is a work of literature. There are books based on it. It has many chapters. It is really, really long form. It takes about 300 hours to go through, and it tells a lot of intertwining stories over an enormous amount of time, and you have to progress those stories and make decisions about how it's going to move forward. All of that is stuff you can't do in a book, a movie, a TV show, even on YouTube. All of those things are so much more passive, and it's very hard to make something that's 300 hours long. Not impossible, but hard. But with video games, making a 300-hour game, okay, is still pretty hard, but it is plausible, and there's lots of games that have done it, Skyrim being just an awesome example of one that tells lots of great stories and pushes different areas of storytelling and interactivity forward and helps us to engage our mental capacity in a way that most traditional media does not. I had no idea that was going to be my topic for the day. That kind of just happened. Sometimes that's how I am. Start talking, and here we go. We did about 20 minutes on that. We're going to call it a day. Please remember to like and subscribe. If you would like to support the channel, you can buy me a coffee directly in the links below. If you can, please share on social media. We need to get the word out about the channel. It's the only way that people find it. And of course, like and, no, I said that. If you'd like to comment, so it starts off the same way. Comment if you have any questions. How do you feel about books and movies and all that stuff? Get down there in the comments and let me know. Interact with everyone else who's watching the channel. If you want to see how YouTube can be used for education, check out my Sam IT channel. If you go to my main page for this vlog, look below, Sam IT. That is my IT and business education channel where I take this very seriously. And of course, if you want to see what I'm like as an author, go check out my book. As passive entertainment as it is, it's not really entertainment, it's nonfiction, but Linux administration best practices, you can buy that in the links below. That supports me directly as well. It makes a very big difference. Thanks for joining me. I will see all of you tomorrow.